In 1901, the government of Guatemala had a problem. They had no one to deliver their letters. They had no postal service, and they needed to find someone to handle that for them. So they hired a little company by the name of United Fruit Company. United Fruit wasn't hired to grow bananas, not to build railroads or infrastructure. They were hired to deliver the mail. This
That's
surprised me
interesting,
when I
isn't it?
first read
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
because what? If you've gotten this far, that should surprise you as well.
Yeah.
So this was an administrative contract between the United Fruit Company and the country of Guatemala, a practical arrangement between a cash-strapped government and a well-organized American company with logistics infrastructure already in place across basically the entirety of the Caribbean.
hmm
The kind of thing that gets a paragraph in a budget ledger and no coverage in the press. Because why would it, right?
Right.
Guatemala needed reliable mail service. UFC had the network. The contract made sense. However, attached to it were land grants for facilities, for sorting depots and transit routes, parcels of Guatemalan territory transferred to an American fruit company in exchange for postal service. Welcome back to Farms and Frontlines, everybody. I am your host, Max Terzano, and I am joined, as always, by the one and the only Jessica Rudo.
Hello.
We have finally arrived in Guatemala. We took quite a trip around Central
Central
America
America, yeah.
this series, and we finally gotten to Guatemala, located just above Honduras in Central America, for our final episode of the Banana Wars series. Final country-based episode, I should say.
Yeah.
The story starts a lot more innocently than you might suspect. Starts with a mail contract in 1901. It ends, quote unquote, with a CIA coup in 1954. What
That
happens between
escalated quickly.
Yeah, right? Like, hey, will you deliver our mail? Well, now you're overthrowing our government. This is terrible. What happens in between is the subject of this episode, and the answer to why those two events are the same story. Now, Guatemala is technically outside the official Banana Wars timeframe.
Right.
The wars closed in 1934 when Franklin Roosevelt introduced the Good Neighbor policy. United States formally renounces military intervention in Latin America. Notwithstanding, United Fruit Company was there at the beginning and long after.
hmm
Guatemala in the early 1900s lacked the capital to build the infrastructure its agricultural economy required. The fruit companies provided that infrastructure. In exchange, they received land. Seems innocent enough, right?
Right.
The concession model in Guatemala operated through a succession of cooperative governments, most notably the dictatorship of Manuel Estrada Cabrera, who ruled from 1898 to 1920, the same year the Banana Wars officially began, 1898, not
Not
1920.
1920, right.
Yeah. Under Cabrera and his successors, UFC acquired control of Guatemala's only railroad, its primary Atlantic port in Puerto Barrios,
hmm
and hundreds of thousands of acres of Caribbean lowland. Hundreds of thousands of acres.
Yeah,
That's
that's a
crazy.
lot.
For like a company that's like, hey, will you deliver our mail? Hey, wait, now you own hundreds of thousands of our land? How?
Did they ask for, or is that what Guatemala offered?
I think this is just like how it expanded, right?
Yeah. Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, under Cabrera, UFC acquired
hmm
control. The terms were, by any standard, extraordinary. Tax exemptions, import duty waivers, land at nominal cost, labor laws that permitted UFC to enforce work requirements on the rural population. The railroad, as we saw in Honduras, didn't serve the Guatemalan national economy. It ran from the banana plantations of the Caribbean lowlands to the port. It didn't connect the Guatemalan interior to the capital. It didn't connect Guatemalan farmers to Guatemalan markets. Connected United Fruit's land to United Fruit's ships.
Yeah, that's always how it is. It sounds helpful to the emerging economy of
Mhm.
this developing nation, but it's really to profit this
Right.
private company.
By the late 1930s, the United Fruit Company controlled Guatemala's only means of Atlantic export, its primary railroad, its telegraph system, and large tracts of its most productive agricultural land. The Guatemalan state was, in practice, a secondary institution in the economic geography of its own territory. Paul Dosel, Doing Business with the Dictators, A Political History of United Fruit in Guatemala, 1899 through 1944. Scholarly Resources, 1993. Guatemalans had a name. for UFC.
Hmm.
They called it El Pulpo, the
The
octopus,
octopus, yeah.
which I think kind of is fitting, right?
Yeah. And that also should show you how much they understood what was actually going on.
There's a really good political cartoon I saw of El
Mhm.
Pulpo that I'll attach to the newsletter.
Yeah, I was looking for one, and that's what led me to there's actually like a whole article on like octopus maps and
Right, I
octopus
saw this.
drawings to like
Yeah,
cover political events. Yeah.
we'll also put that in the because yeah, the first one I saw was like the Irish Free State, and I was like, how
Yeah,
does that
Irish
tie
Free
to
State. Yeah.
Guatemala? And then I read your
Why is there an
comment. I was like,
octopus
oh right,
in
okay, never
Ireland?
mind.
Yeah.
So by 1950, the United Fruit Company held approximately 550,000 acres of land in Guatemala, which equates to 42% of all Guatemalan land.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Could you
Yeah.
imagine? Like we've done episodes on China owning a little bit of US land. Could you imagine if it was like they own 42% of America?
Yeah.
Like,
Then people would pay attention.
right? Like that's just,
Yeah.
I can't
A
even
lot.
fathom it.
It's sizable. Yeah.
So here's the kicker too. And of that 42%, roughly 85% of it was left uncultivated.
Yeah. That's right. And that means it's not being used. It's just
Yes,
playing
it's just
fallow. Yeah.
vacant. Yeah.
Hmm.
So you might think that's odd, but it was actually intentional. UFC held land in reserves as a buffer against Panama disease, which we mentioned when we were talking about our old friend Big Mike.
That's right. The banana.
Yes.
The banana variation.
It was a fungal infection that had already wiped out the Gros Michel, aka Big Mike
Yep.
banana variety, and that could devastate any plantation at any time. Idle land was insurance against crop failure, so it was really just like a buffer zone.
It didn't work though, just FYI. By
Ah,
the
well,
50s, Big Mike is all gone. Yeah.
yeah, Big Mike was gone, but was that what they were growing in Guatemala? Do we
They were
know?
growing it everywhere.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay,
Because
because it was so popular.
the rise of popularity in the US, they're like, okay, that's all we're gonna grow now.
Idle land was insurance against crop failure, even though it didn't work. It was also leverage. A competitor could not enter the market if UFC already owned the land. The land that sat fallow in Guatemala was not land the company needed. It was land the company needed no one else to have. Paul Dosel, doing business with the dictators. The rural population surrounding that idle land, predominantly indigenous Maya, remained landless. They worked the harvest seasons on company plantations and subsistence farmed what marginal land they could access. In 1944, that era ended for a moment. A popular uprising overthrew the dictatorship of Jorge Obico, a strongman who had been one of the company's most reliable partners. What followed was called the October Revolution, Guatemala's first genuinely competitive elections, won by Juan Jose Arevalo, a philosopher and educator who had spent the Ubico years in exile in Argentina.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting too.
That is very interesting, honestly. Arevalo's project was the construction of a modern democratic state. Labor rights, social security, public education, the institutional architecture that most Central American nations had not been permitted to build during the concession era. That's pretty cool, pretty like
Yeah.
forward thinking. In 1947, that project produced the Labor Code. Now, I'm all about that. I mean, we talked about how labor helped in Honduras and all those other
The
areas,
union.
right? The Labor Code was a comprehensive labor reform. Minimum wage protections, restrictions on the company labor recruitment systems UFC had relied on for decades, and most significantly, the right of agricultural workers on large plantations to organize unions on United Fruits plantations for the first time. UFC's response was immediate. The company denounced the labor code, threatening to withdraw from Guatemala entirely, and dispatched lobbyists to the State Department and to Congress. Now, when I first read that, I was like, well, Guatemala probably should have just been like, yeah, leave, good, get out. But like UFC was a massive employer,
The
not a,
biggest employer.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's not that easy.
Right. There would have been a lot of like ripple effects of that.
Yeah,
And if this newly elected president is trying to like set some codes in and the biggest employer leaves, like how is that going to work for
right. It's
everybody
like,
else trying to take in these labor codes,
your plans made us all broke. So the State Department's response in 1947 focused on protecting American investment from what they viewed as unfair labor laws. And Jess, you were saying they were like
Yeah,
anti-American labor laws is how they viewed them, right?
right. The State Department looked at it and thought these were discriminatory towards American companies
Hmm.
because you had to have a certain number of employees. I believe the number is like 233 employees.
Hmm.
And a large majority of the companies in Guatemala that had that number of employees were
Right.
American.
Okay.
And again, UFC is the biggest of all of them.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Hmm.
So I think it's just important to clarify here that this was viewed originally as like a business dispute and
That's right.
a not immediately as a Cold War emergency.
That's right.
But over the next several years, that purely corporate dispute was gradually conflated with Cold War anti-communism.
And that's going to make sense, right? Because in 47, it's after World War II. There's like a little bit of that talk about communism, communist spread, but
Hmm.
that continues to that continues to grow. Those conversations continue to happen. So it's not surprising that this sentiment is going to spread into this area of the world as well.
And in previous episodes, we've talked about Edward Bernays
Yep.
and
Yep.
Árbenz. But by the time Árbenz passes Decree 900 in 1952, the two arguments had merged in the minds of enough State Department officials and congressmen that they were no longer distinguishable. When Bernays arrived with the media campaign later that year, he was not introducing a new idea. He was accelerating a conflation that had been developing for 5 years, giving it the infrastructure to move from government offices and into the press.
And I just want to hit on, so Decree 900 is going to be the land reform, taking land that's not being used and
Mhm.
redistributing it to the Bernays media campaign is what he was good at was taking actual facts and then like twisting them, like
Yeah.
how are you looking at it and how is it being framed?
Yep.
So he was just taking what people were saying and seeing and then being like, well, what if it's communism?
Yeah,
Put a
could
little,
be.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And people were like, you are correct.
You are so right. Yeah.
We can't afford for you to be wrong. Jacobo Árbenz was elected president of Guatemala in 1950 with 65% of the vote. International observers described the election as free and fair. He was an army officer, not an ideologue. His predecessor, Arevalo, like we just talked about, had spent 6 years building the foundations of a modern democratic state with labor rights, social security, public education. Árbenz intended to continue that work and add one more component, land reform, like I just mentioned with Decree 900.
Hmm.
His argument was economic, not revolutionary. Guatemala could not develop an independent agricultural economy as long as the majority of the arable land was concentrated in the hands of a small number of large landowners, most of them foreign and most of them not farming it.
The latifundio system, through which a small number of large landowners hold the majority of arable land in idleness while the rural population remains landless, is the fundamental obstacle to Guatemala's economic development. The purpose of this decree is to liquidate feudal property in the countryside and to develop peasant capitalist methods of production in agriculture. Decree 900, Guatemalan Agrarian Reform Law, June 17, 1952. Preamble. Full text archived at Biblioteca Nacional de Guatemala.
Decree 900 was the instrument. Uncultivated private land holdings above more than 200 acres could be expropriated by the government. Owners would receive compensation equal to the declared tax value of the land. The redistributed land would be leased to landless peasants on long-term agreements.
Which is cool.
So,
We've
yeah.
talked previously about Decree 900 and how all that worked and UFC's shady tax reportings and all that. But
Yeah.
giving the land that they were taking to landless peasants is something we haven't talked about before. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and again, trying to put the people that need land to work economically, and then we'll also talk a little bit later. It just kind of gives back dignity to those working their own land.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Between 1952 and 1954, approximately 500,000 acres were redistributed to around 100,000 Guatemalan families because the United Fruit Company lost approximately 400,000 acres.
4/5 of that.
400,000 were UFC. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Guatemalan government offered compensation of 1.48 million, the figure the United Fruit Company itself had declared in its own tax filings. So the tax filings gets a little complicated because in the 30s, the Guatemalan dictator Ubico had worked a deal with UFC for like a lease of 99 years, and they got a bunch of tax breaks. And because UFC got a bunch of those tax breaks, they devalued their land so they didn't have to pay like a corporate tax, basically. So it's a devaluation, but it's so they could get around corporate taxes because they were already getting a ton of tax breaks.
Right.
So the actual valuation of the land was 15.8 million. So it's like way under, what UFC thought it was worth. So the United Fruit Company goes to the State Department, tells them like they're only going to pay me 1.5 million when it should be almost 16 million.
Crazy.
So the State Department, and I just want to point out, so we've talked about this in previous episodes, but the people in government are on the board of UFC.
Yeah.
So they have a personal stake in what's going on with the company.
And it's not like they're just like staffers, like they're the Dulles brothers, like the head of the Secretary of State and the director of the CIA.
They're like, right, they're high up in government, but they're also, on the board for UFC. So not surprisingly, right, like the State Department formally protested to the Guatemalan government on UFC's behalf, demanding a higher figure.
The Guatemalan government's response was direct. The compensation offered was based on the company's own declared valuations. The United States was, in effect, demanding that Guatemala pay more for land than the company had reported owning. Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer, Bitter Fruit. The Story of the American Coup in Guatemala. Harvard University Press, 1999.
Árbenz was not expropriating UFC's productive land. He was reacquiring the land UFC was not using. The land it was holding specifically to prevent anyone else from using it. The distinction was legally precise and politically explosive. This act was pretty important for indigenous groups, as most had not owned land since the Spanish conquest. The reform was credited for helping many Guatemalans find dignity and autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're taking land that was literally only being held so no one else could use it.
Yeah, and some of the land is, it's going to sit dormant and then they'll plant on it later. But most of it, as you mentioned, those stats, like they're not using a lot of it.
For sure. So like, it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
By 1952, direct military intervention of Latin America was not politically viable because of the good neighbor policy.
Right.
Nicaragua had demonstrated the cost of a prolonged counterinsurgency. The Senate had asked uncomfortable questions. The press had found its way into the mountain. So that wasn't an option. Sending in the Marines, right, wasn't an option anymore. But the goal of shaping political and economic outcomes in the hemisphere had not changed. What changed was the instrument. In August of 1953, the CIA had successfully removed Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh from power in Operation Ajax. Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The CIA ran a covert operation, paid agents, fabricated crises, psychological warfare, and he was gone. The Shah was restored, the oil concessions were reversed, the template was fresh. Guatemala was next on the menu, and Jess and I are talking about this a bit. This is new, right? Like, this was not something the U.S. had been doing for a long time. This was the second time it would be tried in Guatemala.
It's actually so I looked it up a little bit. So the CIA is made in 1947 with the National Security Act of 1947. And they try a couple things. The CIA tries like election interference in Italy, and they tried a couple other of like, they tried to be, crafty and fail. But 53 is successful. So this is their first like successful covert operation. Yeah.
Right. The Eisenhower administration had its own Cold War logic independent of UFC's interests. A small Guatemalan Communist Party held several positions in the Árbenz government. It didn't control it. It wasn't a majority or anything like that. In the context of 1953, Korea, McCarthy, the Soviet atomic program, any leftward movement in the Western Hemisphere drew immediate attention in Washington. The whole like Red Scare thing is this time.
It's definitely ramping up. Yep.
Yeah. So what UFC provided was not the decision to act. It provided the narrative infrastructure to make that decision look like something other than what it was. And that's where we talked about Edward Bernays a lot. He had worked with the United Fruit Company before. with the campaign linking bananas to health, placement of celebrity contacts, planted news stories about their nutritional value. He did his thing, right? So they were familiar with him. But in 1952, they hired him again. And this time, the product wasn't bananas; it was the entire country of Guatemala.
It was the whole government.
Yeah, the entire government. Bernays organized press junkets for American journalists, providing curated access to UFC operations and hand-selected sources. He was very deliberate about what they saw and what he told them, and
And who
all
they
that
talked
stuff.
to.
Exactly.
Yep.
He distributed materials to editors, congressmen, State Department officials, framing Guatemala's land reform as the leading edge of Soviet communism in the Western Hemisphere. He coined and circulated the phrase "Red Guatemala," which, I mean, it makes sense. Like he said, and we talked about before, he said, they gave me a job. I did my job. Right.
Yep.
He didn't fabricate any facts. He didn't just lie. The land reform was real. The Communist Party of Guatemala was real. The expropriation of UFC land was real. What Bernays did was arrange those real facts into a frame that made a corporate land dispute look like a Cold War emergency. He was also not working with a cold audience. UFC had been calling Guatemala communist since 1947 when Arevalo passed the labor code. So I guess that makes sense, right? When they're trying to get more labor rights, the UFC's like, oh, that's communism. They're trying to give the people more rights, The State Department officials receiving Bernays' materials had been hearing that argument for 5 years. So he didn't invent the frame, he industrialized it.
Bernays' Guatemala campaign was one of the most effective corporate propaganda operations in American history, not because it fabricated events, but because it shaped the frame through which real events were understood. He did not invent these facts. He arranged them into a narrative that made the CIA-backed coup look like a necessary response to a Soviet threat rather than a commercial intervention on behalf of a fruit company. Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer, Bitter Fruit.
And that leads us to, the meat and potatoes of this episode.
It is, but it's weird because it's only a couple of days long. The covert operation is called Operation PB Success. It was authorized by the Eisenhower administration in 1953 and executed on June 18th, 1954. The operation had two primary components. The first was a small CIA-trained and equipped exile army organized in Honduras and Nicaragua, the countries where, as this series has documented, the United States had spent decades building compliant governments and military infrastructure. The army crossed into Guatemala. It was not large enough to defeat the Guatemalan military in open combat, but that was not its purpose. But the second component is what really plays into this, and it was psychological warfare. A CIA-operated radio transmitter in Honduras broadcast false reports of a massive rebel army advancing on the capital. The broadcasts were designed to create the impression of an overwhelming force that did not exist. The radio transmitter was aimed less at the Guatemalan public, but at the Guatemalan officer corps. Several of Árbenz's senior commanders had been cultivated by the CIA in the preceding months, not converted to the exile cause, but made uncertain, made to doubt whether the resistance was winnable, made to prefer negotiation to combat. That's key.
Crazy. That's crazy.
When the broadcast reported an unstoppable advance, it was those officers that told Árbenz's the cause was lost. The psychological operation worked, not because it deceived the population, but because it paralyzed the military. Isn't that wild?
They got them so scared of a force that didn't exist.
They just had to put doubt in their minds, and that caused all the cracks and crevices to fall apart.
Crazy.
Yeah. On June 27th, 1954, Árbenz's resigned the presidency and went into exile. And you told me earlier he went to Mexico.
Yep.
The CIA's involvement was not acknowledged by the United States government until 1997, when declassified documents confirmed the operational details.
The coup was not a response to a Soviet threat. The Soviet Union had no significant presence in Guatemala and no operational role in the Árbenz's government. The Guatemalan Communist Party, though vocal, held a small number of positions in a government that was fundamentally nationalist and reformist in character. The communist framing was a political instrument, and it worked. Piero Glejesus, Shattered Hope, The Guatemalan Revolution and the United States, 1944 through 1954, Princeton University Press, 1991.
What a story, huh?
Isn't that crazy? So what came after? So the government that replaced Árbenz was organized and installed with CIA support. The Arevalo and Árbenz years, where they built all this good stuff, immediately was deconstructed.
With the help of God and our patriotic soldiers, we have toppled the communist tyranny which had dishonored Guatemala. Carlos Castillo Armas. Address to the nation following the coup, July 1954.
On land, Armas issued Decree 31, which annulled Decree 900 entirely. The 400,000 acres United Fruit had lost went back to the company, but the restoration went further than a return of the status quo. New concessions were extended to UFC. Additional tax exemptions were granted. The company that had claimed its land was worth $15.8 million, got the land back, and came out with better terms than it had before the Árbenz years began.
Wild.
The approximately 100,000 Guatemalan families who had received land under Decree 900 had their titles voided. Many were physically removed from the land that they had been farming for 2 years. The National Agrarian Department, the administrative body Árbenz had built to implement this reform, was dissolved.
Man.
I know. On labor, in the 1947 Labor Code, which UFC had been calling communist since the day it was signed, was gutted. The provisions covering agricultural work on large plantations, the provisions that had allowed UFC workers to organize, were repealed. The unions that had formed during the Arevalo-Árbenz decades were dismantled. Their leaders were arrested, driven into exile, or killed, which again is interesting because in Honduras, they get unions.
Yeah.
In Guatemala, they do not.
Nope.
On political participation, Castillo Arbenz disenfranchised illiterate voters. In early 1950s Guatemala, that meant a large population of the rural indigenous population, the same population that had most benefited from the land reform and had organized most visibly to support it. The political system was adjusted to remove it from the people the previous decade had brought into it. It's always how it is, you know?
Right.
Political parties were banned, literacy programs were dismantled, and thousands of people were arrested.
See, that right there is one of the most telling things to me is when literacy programs are dismantled. You don't want what's good for your people if you're dismantling literacy programs.
But it's never, I mean, like we've talked about, it's never about the people, right?
Yeah.
It's about the state.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. There is a connection between the disposition of 1954 and the war that followed 6 years later that the official history tends to treat as coincidental. It was not. The 100,000 families who had land and then had it taken back did not disappear. The union organizers who had spent a decade building labor infrastructure did not disappear. The political networks that had formed around Arevalo's civic programs did not disappear. They began the organizational substrate of the insurgency that began in 1960. They were not radicalized in the abstract. They had specific, recent, concrete grievances. They knew what had been taken from them, when, and by whom. Guatemala then entered a cycle of military rule and armed insurgency that lasted 36 years.
I think that's a really important paragraph you just read. Like,
yeah,
none of the they just completely disenfranchised and literally stole land back from people after overthrowing a democratically elected government, dismantled literacy programs, took back hundreds of thousands of acres of lands that these people were farming, killed union organizers. Like, what do you think the people are going to do?
And then took away their right to vote.
Yeah. And then we're like, and by the way, this is what you're stuck with.
And then you have people that are already pretty much at the end of their rope, and then you tell them you can't learn anymore. You can't learn to read.
Yeah.
You don't have land, and we're taking it back, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what do you expect them to do? Yeah.
Right? Like, just sit there and be happy with that?
What do you expect them to do? Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. Like I just said, they go into a civil war basically for 36 years. And it goes 1960 to 1996. But the estimated death toll is about 200,000 people. The vast majority of those that were killed were indigenous Maya civilians. They're killed by the Guatemalan state security forces. And 1999, the UN-backed Historical Clarification Commission, so it's just a section of the UN, concluded that those acts were genocidal against the Mayan population. So it is a genocide that is happening in Guatemala.
Which, like, we'll talk more about it later when we do our series wrap up. But Postal Service to genocide,
maniacs.
like, It's just kind of crazy.
Well, we do have to say though, like it's not the UFC,
No,
right?
but you can see
It's
their
the,
fingerprints all over it.
you're right. But I do think we need to be specific in what
You
we're
have to
saying.
clarify.
So the
Yes,
UFC
they
is
did not
hired to be
commit.
the mail clerks to
Right.
the post office. However, the UFC is not the one yet.
Right. It wasn't like they had UFC
killing the
uniforms
Mayans, yeah.
on, but that's just like their meddling and relation to the United States government and operations. You could see their fingerprints all over it.
Yeah. And I mean, the UFC is still in Guatemala at this point. Like they're not kicked out of the country or anything. Like
I mean, they just got the silver platter, you know, they got everything they wanted and more.
Right.
Crazy.
The thread from the concession era land grants to that finding, that genocidal finding, runs directly. The UFC land grants in the early 1900s dispossessed rural Mayan communities from land they had held under communal tenure systems that predate the Republic. The Arevalo and Árbenz years were the first sustained attempt to address the disposition through legal means. The coup reversed those attempts, restored the land concentration, gutted the labor protection, and removed the rural population from political participation. What came after were the institutions built to preserve that inequality by force.
The coup of 1954 did not, by itself, produce the Civil War or the genocide, but it ended the one democratic government in Guatemalan history that had attempted to address the structural inequality, the land concentration, the landless rural population, the export economy controlled by outside interests that made the country ungovernable. What came after it were the institutions built to preserve that inequality by force. Piero Glihesis, Shattered Hope.
United Fruit Company became United Brands in 1970. In 1975, its chief executive died under disputed circumstances after it emerged he had paid $1.25 million in bribes to the president of Honduras in exchange for a reduction in banana export taxes. And we talked a little bit about that in our Honduras episode. Scandal was known as Bananagate. United Brands eventually became Chiquita Brands International, which you may be familiar with. Their shenanigans don't stop in Guatemala, however, and they don't stop in the 50s or the 60s. They continue to basically present day.
Yeah.
In 2007, Chiquita Brands International pleaded guilty in U.S. federal court to making payments to the AUC, the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a right-wing paramilitary organization designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States government. The company paid a $25 million fine. Federal prosecutors found that Chiquita had made $49.4 million in profit from its Colombian operations during the same period it was funding the AUC. No executive spent a day in jail. The company's stated rationale was that it had paid the AUC to protect its employees. Internal records told a different story. The senior director had gone to the board before the payments were disclosed and recommended selling the Colombian operations entirely because of the protection money issue. The board didn't sell. The payments continued for 3 years after the U.S. government designated the AUC as a terrorist organization. So they knew they were paying terrorists protection money. Families of the victims of the AUC violence did not see a penny of the $25 million fine. That money went to the U.S. government. However, in April 2024, a civil trial began in federal court in West Palm Beach, Florida. The plaintiffs were the families of the men killed by the AUC in Colombia's banana-growing region during the 1990s and early 2000s. Trade unionists, banana workers, political organizers, social activists, they weren't like one or two people, right?
Yeah.
Their lawyers argued that Chiquita had not merely paid the AUC under duress, but had willingly partnered with the organization to suppress labor organizing and protect its profits, which, if you know anything about the history of this company that we've talked about, should not surprise you.
Yeah, just to reiterate, like they hired a hit squad. They hired gunmen to kill people.
Yes, like it's very well documented.
Yeah.
On June 10th, 2024, the jury found Chiquita liable. It awarded $38.3 million in damages to the families of 8 victims. It was the first time a U.S. corporation had been found liable in an American court for human rights abuses committed abroad. That's crazy, isn't it? The structural logic that organized UFC's operations in Central America, concessions, compliant governments, suppression of labor organizing by whatever instrument was available, had not disappeared. It had traveled. And in 2024, for the first time, a jury said so out loud. Now, if we haven't been clear enough over the past 6 episodes, here's a quick refresher. The thread connecting all of it was food. The banana made the corporations made the infrastructure led to the intervention logic, the intervention logic produced the coups, the occupations, the constabularies, and the dictators. And the instability those structures left behind is not in Guatemala or anywhere else in the series' ancient history.
The 1954 coup has sometimes been described as the event that ended the Banana Wars era. A more precise description is that it demonstrated what the era had built, a hemisphere in which the United States had so thoroughly conditioned the political and economic environment of its smaller neighbors that a democratically elected government pursuing legal land reform could be removed in weeks by a covert operation and a radio transmitter. The Banana Wars did not end in 1954. They became the Cold War. Nick Cullither, Secret History, the CIA's classified account of its operations in Guatemala, 1952 through 1954. Stanford University Press, 1999.
So next up, we have a conversation with Dr. Michael Kangemi. He is the author of the book, Blessed Are the Activists, on how activists help restore dignity, increase literacy, address hunger, and more. And it's a great conversation. Please check that out when it comes out.
We're very excited about it, and we really do hope you enjoyed this series. I mean, I know I say this a lot, but I really did learn a lot, and that's why we do this, right? Like, not just to educate others, but also for ourselves, because we're super fascinated with this stuff. And I mean, it is a wild story of how it went from a postal service in early 1900s to being found guilty of paying gunmen to kill, to be hit squads in 2024, right? Like,
that's right.
This empire of food, but it was interesting to see how it got there.
It's still around.
Still there. You still see their bananas in every single grocery store in the United States that you walk into. Like, it's not like they were found guilty of all these things and the company folded. It's still a major, massive company.
Right.
And what's crazy too is it's not like we're the first to discover this, right? Like, this is all very well documented stuff. So it's not like it's known. It's just, oh well. So
I would say though, like, I don't know that I would have come across this history if I wasn't like looking for it, you know?
Yeah.
So it's not like a super well-known story.
No. But if you are interested in learning more, just re-listen to this whole series on repeat multiple times. Or you could sign up for our newsletter at farmsandfrontlines.substack.com for a list of all the sources we use in every episode. Just click the episode story and you can see all the sources, books, articles, Office of the Historian.
A lot of great books about it. A
lot of great books, a lot of great sources. So check it out. And thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Hope you'll tune in next episode for our conversation with Dr. Kangemi.
Great. We'll talk to you later.